My name is Per, and I lead a Christian think tank in Sweden called the Clapham Institute, borrowing our inspiration from Britain and the work with the Clapham sect there with William Wilberforce and those, trying to influence society with a Christian worldview and Christian faith, sometimes in difficult times, sometimes when they feel victory, but more often difficult times. And I've been doing that for 9 years now, and here at ELF I co-lead the academic network when I'm attending together with David and Sarah. So if there is anyone else here from the academic network, I hope I'll meet you again soon. Academically, I tend to view myself as kind of a detective. My next book will come in September. It's going to be about the Bible. Much more inspiring than the theme that we're going to discuss today. It's going to be about how the Bible is the greatest piece of literature in world history. It's going to be real fun to go out and talk more about the Bible. And my last book in English is a detective story about the resurrection of Jesus, explaining what would happen if the world's greatest detective were to investigate the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So I brought a few copies of that if anyone would want to look at that afterwards. And when I do my academic work, I did my PhD 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, about how Sweden became the most secular individualistic nation in the world, according to the World Values Survey. And I focused on the political sphere then. And that was a kind of detective story investigating how Sweden changed into this very special value culture that we have and that you share in your cultures and nations as well, but that is particularly strong in Sweden. And after that, I began doing a postdoc study on the theme that we're going to go into today, more specifically in Sweden about free Protestant denominations in Sweden, internal secularization, change, and membership commitment. So I will go through the last century of what happened in free Protestant denominations in Sweden. What connections and correlations are there between internal secularization and member commitment? So what I did last year, the first year of this study, was to go, like you do as an academic, you go through previous studies on what has been said and investigated before in these areas. And most of these studies are done in America because it's the largest nation with the largest denominations. But there are also a number of studies done in other nations. So that is what I'm going to focus on in this lecture. Basically a background of what has been shown empirically around the world of the connections between liberal churches and evangelical churches. So let's say that was my personal introduction, and then let's begin the lecture itself, so to speak. So the question for today is, why liberal churches collapse and evangelical churches often, but not always, thrive. And this is not a lecture where I portray my own views about different churches, but rather a descriptive analysis and summary of what previous research has shown around the world of the development of liberal churches and of evangelical churches, and what we can learn from these developments. So to begin with, the question is basically for Christianity as a whole, is Christianity a movement in crisis, like you would see in the left-hand picture? Not too many people coming, not too enthusiastic perhaps. Or on the right-hand picture, you may recognize the building itself is from the revival movement in Asbury in America. Is Christianity basically a movement either of these? And the answer is, like it quite often is, that there are two parallel trends going on at the same time. Sometimes one of them is stronger, sometimes the other is stronger. So Christianity is both a movement that is in crisis, shrinking, and it's also a movement in expansion, while other churches are growing. And the question is there a pattern that we can see a particular kind of churches declining and a particular kind of church growing? And the answer to this question is yes, to put it very short. So my point today is to explain the pattern to you that I think you're all familiar with, but it's good to have them on black and white, so to speak, so to follow the statistics from around the world. So in general, a church develops due to certain factors, and some of them are national, that goes for a whole nation, and some of them are local, depending on matters concerning your local environment. For instance, demographically, is the population growing in your part of the nation, or is it shrinking? That affects the circumstances for the churches. Are there other local things going on in your neighborhood? Or on the national arena, what is happening in your nation? That affects the circumstances for the church. There are also contextual factors that you can't really control. Cultural factors going on in your nation, that affects the church. But there are also institutional factors that depend on the churches themselves, that the churches can actually have influence on. So either of these four, national and local factors, contextual and institutional factors, some of these are quite difficult to influence as a church because they are cultural trends affecting the church. But some of them are things that the church can access and influence themselves. So if we look around at the trend, this is a trend that has been going on in the Western world for at least the last half century or so. This is a picture from Time magazine from 1966 asking the question, is God dead? One of the trends showing that religion decreases and that Christianity is decreasing in the Western world. Europe has been on this trend longer, one could say, from the French Revolution and the Enlightenment onwards. But the United States has had a much stronger Christian heritage in a number of ways. But we see in the last couple of decades in the United States that these contextual factors has shown that the number of Christians, the degree of Christians, has been shrinking quite clearly since the early 1990s in America, while the nuns, so to speak, the religiously unaffiliated, have grown in America, like we have seen in Europe. It's just that the American culture is lagging behind, one could say, in a positive way in this case. But still, the same kind of trends and contextual factors affect most of our countries. And the question is then, why do nations secularize? And I could go on and talk for a long time about this in general, but let's just give a few examples of why nations secularize. One of them is obviously the rise of the individualistic and autonomous philosophy in the West, which has been going on since at least the Enlightenment, moving away the authority from God and moving it over to the independent human, and this autonomous perspective with the independence of the individual being the highest good of all. That goes together with secularization. All these points are very well covered by other scholars, Christians and non-Christian scholars. One other reason is that a stronger or increased economic security among the general population tends to influence secularization. When people become economically wealthier, they don't see the same reason to turn to God. That seems to be a general trend. And thirdly, people in higher education, especially, which is the general pattern in secular academia, that it is a secularized worldview that people meet. And we talk about it in our network, the academic network here, and try to give some suggestions on how to stand as a Christian academic in such an environment. It is challenging, but it's possible. But a secularized higher education tends to function secularizing in a society, especially over time as each generation becomes educated, become teachers, and then go out and teach the younger generations. Fourthly, when a society weakens in family and in traditional marriage, that tends to go in a secularizing direction too. Family is important. Family is important in several ways, but not least in underpinning religion. A weakened family goes together with weakening of religion. And of course, we have seen in the media, this is the case in some churches more particular than others, the Catholic churches especially, when public scandals in the church has made people move away from these churches. And especially, as you know, they have a tendency to focus on either or a combination of money, sex, and power. And lastly, and this is interesting and telling, when Christians sort of move upwards in the culture and improve their status in society, that means that it becomes more costly to stand for another worldview, to oppose the secular mindset, the secular environment. So when Christians move upwards, either in economy or in social status, they become less prone to criticize the secular environment. So these are some points in explaining the general secular trend. But looking historically, I'm going to give you a few examples now from the United States, as they are such a large nation and large Christian denominations, which show the trends clearer than elsewhere, showing that some denominations, they move strongly for a while, then they reach a certain stage and some certain tendencies that seem to affect all denominations. And after a while, they seem to shrink. Let me show you the 3 denominations that were strongest when the United States declared themselves independent in 1776. Those were the Congregationalists, the Episcopalians, and the Presbyterians. And if you look over the environment, both in your nation and in the United States, you wouldn't feel that the Congregationalists and Episcopalians and Presbyterians are the strongest movements, but they were, very clearly. But something happened from 1776 and up to 1850. You could see that these denominations, they were shrinking clearly in percentage of total adherents. And you could see that the Baptists were coming on stronger, and especially the Methodists. They were the really strong movement, and you could see a revival movement where people were coming to faith, and the Methodist Church were a really, really strong movement. And one would think that they would grow forever because they were such a strong movement. But things change, and all denominations, they face a certain point in their development where they reach either some kind of crisis or some kind of new birth or some new power, but mostly they tend to go in a curve like this. You see, the Methodists, they were growing incredibly fast up until somewhere around 1850. And that was their maximum, around 1850. Then the same factors kicked in, in all denominations that lose strength, and they were gradually losing influence and membership. Also in market share. But you see, all this time, the Baptist movement was growing and growing and growing. And up until the mid-1950s, one would think that the Baptists, that was the movement for the future. They could not fail, but of course they could. There were a number of reasons that made them go, like from 1950s and onwards, and begin to shrink, especially because the Baptists were splitting in North America, the more liberal in the north and the more conservative in the south. But this is a quite common pattern. So if we move into the 1900s now and look of market share here too, I've been using, as you see here in the notes, a study by Rodney Stark and Roger Finke, who have been explaining the churches in America from 1776 and onwards. And I think these numbers are very telling, because as a population grows, a denomination that does fairly, they will also grow, and they might feel quite content with growing. But if they grow slower than the population as a whole, their market share sociologists of religion tend to talk about religion as in marketing terms sometimes. And I think that works quite well, because if you see here, the mainline churches in America, which are generally liberal, theologically speaking, they were really strong. They were the dominating churches in America up until the mid-1900s. But you see, already from 1940, they began to shrink in market share, and over time, they have been shrinking very much. While here are some examples that Stark and Finke use of evangelical denominations, or charismatic, Pentecostal, and so on. And you see some of them grow fairly steady, and some of them grow enormously. So the pattern is very, very clear when it comes to America, and also when it comes to other nations. But I think these statistics are quite clear. They would say, these liberal denominations around the 1950s, that we're growing, it's going fine, but their market share was steadily shrinking, but they didn't really realize it because the numbers were still growing up until around 1960, when the downfall was beginning to be stronger. So some reasons then, built on previous scholars who have investigated this in detail. They say that there are some general factors that make liberal churches shrink. One of them is, of course, that they are not so strong in evangelism. And that sort of goes without saying, doesn't it? That a church that doesn't reach out to people and invite them to become believers, they don't grow like churches who do. So that makes some kind of intuitive sense to it. Another thing that happens to, well, the challenge affects all denominations. Some manage to control it, but it's quite very common that denominations happen after a couple of decades into a situation where they institutionalize. They build a larger bureaucracy. They start to align more with other denominations and the state, and it becomes more professionalized, which means that the lay people, the general believers, the general members in the local congregations, their commitment reduces, because, you know, there are people up there who manage this, and they have control over things. They know what to do, and the member commitment decreases over time. It's also quite often the case that when denominations become more institutionalized, they tend to become more close with the state, with the political power, and with the general elite in the nation. Because it is tempting for all people, including us here, to be liked by society, to be liked by the establishment in a society. It's much more comfortable rather than being in the outskirts of society. That is a real temptation, and if you're not aware of it, it will affect and happen to every church. And also, when the distinctive Christian identity weakens over time, that decreases the distinctive character of church life and willingness to engage. That means that if you don't feel that a church membership, a church commitment is highly important in my life, that is something that I give my heart to, that I devote my energy and my resources to, if that is reduced due to these other factors, that will decrease the willingness to engage in church life. All of this seems quite intuitive, but it's good sometimes to just put it on black and white. And also, and this is somehow counterintuitive perhaps, but churches that are willing to adapt to contemporary culture are at the same time becoming irrelevant. And that is not my views, that is how it is interpreted in society. You may get the view that churches who try to be friends with contemporary culture, they are accepted, perhaps not always respected, but accepted by the rest of society. But they also become less relevant, and I'm going to give you some examples for it. Now, the issue that is most up on the agenda in our time is the LGBTQ issue. And every time a new trend comes into culture, secular culture, they always give the impression that this is a completely new situation and we need to adapt to it in order to stay relevant in our time. And the same thing goes with the questions in our time, as you are very well aware of. So the question is, does this create a different situation that churches need to adapt to the LGBTQ views of secular society in order to stay relevant? And the answer is, in short, is no, it is not. And this example is not from America, this is from Great Britain, where a mathematical scholar has separated the denominations in Britain according to levels of liberal theology and evangelical theology in this particular field of sexuality and marriage. And the more yellow the denomination is, the more liberal it is in views of sexuality and marriage. And the more red it is, the more evangelical it is. And they have put the Roman Catholic Church in white to separate them. But I think this diagram speaks quite a lot for itself. All liberal denominations shrink, without exception. These numbers are from 2015 to 2020, so they're very much up to date in our time and in the question that is most up for debate in our time, saying that if we want to be relevant in our culture, we need to take on the secular views on marriage and sexuality. But the pattern is enormously clear that all liberal churches that adopt this view, they shrink. You see, by the way, that the Church of England, he has quite diplomatically put them as evangelical and liberal in the similar size. From my experience, I realized from the last General Synod and onwards that the liberal side has won in the Church of England. And that shows where they are in the trend of membership commitment. Of the evangelical churches, you see that most of them grow, not all, and there may be several factors due to why not all evangelical churches grow. And quite often it seems to have something with, do you get stuck in an old church culture that doesn't catch on with today's society and today's needs? You may have a strong confession that if you don't adapt culturally in ways of having church, not the content, but the ways of having church, that seems to affect that not all evangelical churches grow. And I think you know of such examples in your nations too, that there are churches that may have a strong confession, but they have got stuck in some older traditions that don't attract young people of today. But this is a very clear picture in our time, in our part of the world. And one could look into local congregations. Maybe local congregations could form exceptions to the rule. And I was particularly interested in looking into an example from a scholar named Donald Miller, who wrote a really good book about the development in American Protestantism in 1997. He said, like I said now, that there are certain factors that make churches grow or to shrink. And he captured them really well, I think. But then he added, I belong to an exception. I belong to a liberal church in Pasadena in California. And that is a vivid and growing liberal church. So I was interested in what has happened to that church since 1997. That would be really interesting to find out. Because in 1997 he said that, well, we are an ideologically progressive church. And he described their views as the only truth defined as one's responsibility as a Christian to pursue issues of justice and peace. You see, a postmodern view, very identity political and focused on inner worldly issues. And he said that we attract new people who don't feel at home in other churches. Former Catholics come to us, former fundamentalists come to us, also people who are lesbians and gays who felt condemned in their old churches. They come to us. And I looked into their webpage now, and they still follow this way of being church very clearly. All Saints Church in Pasadena, what do they work for? They work for radical inclusion. Yes, they do. You are welcome at our table, everyone. And also this justice. We challenge power and privilege in the world in our church. You see the same progressive views as in other progressive churches around the world. And the question is Donald Miller right that this may be a winning strategy for this church? And in that case, that could prove something. So I tried to look into the matters, how this church has developed over time, and I found it really difficult to get statistical numbers because I mailed the church and asked for them, and they didn't respond. And I've actually experienced a bit of the same thing when I've asked this to declining churches in Sweden. They seem to be quite unwilling to share their numbers if the statistics are not going well. Because the answer for this church is that in the long term, it does not lead to a positive development. And let me compare to the Episcopal Church in general. That is a liberal denomination in America, who are in general decline, like most of them are, or all of them are actually. And you see that membership numbers, they're quite slow. You may remain a member in a church your whole life without ever taking part of it. So the clearest number to show people's member commitment is how much they attend church. And in this denomination, only 75% of the members, they attend church. That is a number to remember then, comparing to this church in All Saints, Pasadena, which I found at the Episcopal Church's webpage. So you can see member commitment on at least 3 levels: giving, membership, and attendance. And you see that they have gradually declined in membership and in giving, but most important and interesting I found was church attendance. You see, all the way from 2011, when the first year in these statistics, they had a very low church attendance. And if you go up to our time, you have to skip 2020 to 2022 because of Corona. But if you look after, in 2023, they have an enormously low number of attendance. And I think that's quite telling, because they proposed to be very, very welcoming. Everyone should come to our church, and it's very attractive. But in the real world, only 7% of the members, they actually attend this church. So there seems to be some kind of paradox here in following popular culture. I actually took this from the Wikipedia page of progressive Christianity, and I think it summarizes it well. 6 colors in the flag, and all are welcome, as opposed to other churches where people are not welcome. This church should attract huge numbers of people. They're so welcoming. But the opposite seems to be the case. And here is a quote that I found telling from Andre Nota, who did his doctoral dissertation on trends in American religion from the 1960s. He said that if you want to target this upper middle class market and modify strategies to meet the needs of this group, the liberal Protestant churches may have become irrelevant for these people. Quite paradoxical, isn't it? And another scholar wrote that while working for justice, that is biblical, that is good and highly commendable, but if this is not accompanied by a strong emphasis on things spiritual, large number of people are left feeling vacuous. And he goes on, this is a study from Canada, saying that every kind of living church ministry, they need to have a clear God focus in the work, because otherwise religious groups say nothing to society that society is not already saying to itself. Because society is saying all these things. And if the church wants to say the same thing in a society in order to be accepted by society, they don't add anything. They just say the same thing that the society is already saying to itself, but without having the dimension that the church is actually called to have. So why is it the case that most, not all, but most evangelical churches grow? Here is a summary of not what I think, but that previous scholars have said. Well, to start out with, evangelical churches generally have a stronger focus on evangelism, and that makes sense. Churches who evangelize, they attract more members because they tell people to come to faith in Jesus and come to their churches. There is also a general higher commitment in church life, which gives more meaning to engage in church, rather than churches who become more institutionalized and where the pastors and the leaders do most of the work. An evangelical church also provides a clear identity, which shows that I belong to another culture than the dominating secular culture in our nation. And one might feel tempted to say that, well, we don't want to be a counter movement, we want to be friends with the culture. But being part of a counter movement that creates a higher commitment, a higher identity, like the church has been ever since its birth 2,000 years ago. The church wasn't very much accepted by the Roman culture, but it grew steadily. Also, an evangelical church resists the secularization, and a conservative theology increases a sense of otherworldliness and readiness to commit. If people are confused or just frustrated with the culture that they live in, they're looking for something else, not just a pious version of what they already hear in their culture. And that is the thing that creates attractivity in evangelical churches. And when we look at our time now, you remember I showed the statistics of religion and Christianity shrinking in America from the 1990s and onwards. There seems to be the beginning of another movement. We don't know exactly where it's going to turn, but there seems to be something different going on, where the trend seems to have stopped somewhere around 2022, where the numbers of Christian in the Pew Research seems to have beginning to grow, and the nuns have begun to shrink. It's still too early to draw conclusions from it, but it is an interesting time that we're in. And some examples from America, where younger adults seem to be more interested in Jesus as a person. Same thing in Britain, on young people who seem to be more willing to come to church. In Norway, where this is a newspaper article from a small village who had a huge revival, where more people were coming to the church meetings there than who lived in that village. In Finland, statistics of young men being more interested and more devout to faith in Jesus and to reading the Bible and so on. And the last numbers I read, there seems to be a similar trend among girls, but it's still too early to draw clear conclusions from. But very interesting. And finally, Sweden, even Sweden. There are signs of this, of revival. In all these nations, this is not the whole picture. There are two parallel trends going on at the same time. Churches weakening, adapting to secular culture, and also churches, and especially individuals, who become more thirsty for the truth, for the gospel. So it is a really interesting time that we're in. So this is my last slide, where we just summarize where we are. Because previous studies show that there is a clear connection between theological stance and membership commitment. Both that people come and become members of churches, and that they are actually committed and living members of their churches. And I borrowed some points from Dean Haughey. He's an American sociologist of religion, who found extremely strong correlations of liberal churches decreasing and evangelical churches increasing, depending on three factors. He investigated a large number of factors in the United States from the 1950s and onwards. And he showed that in three factors, liberal churches very clearly decrease, and evangelical churches who have an evangelical stance on these factors, they increase. They were theological liberalism. Churches that have a liberal theology, they shrink clearly, and the opposite in evangelical churches. an emphasis on distinctive lifestyle and morality. We hear very often that we need to be more tolerant towards alternative lifestyles, and people would like us and come to our churches. That is not the case, manifestly not the case. The opposite is true. And thirdly, affirmation on individualism and pluralism in belief. We should be more pluralistic and tolerate different points of view in theology. But Dean Hoggy is very clear that these three are extremely strong correlations of growing evangelical churches and decreasing liberal churches. And as said and showed in these statistics, all liberal churches, they shrink over time. Not all evangelical churches grow, but most. So the point seems to be to combine, this is my main conclusion here today, that those churches and denominations that grow are those two who, one, keep to conservative theology, two, manage to embrace musical and other kinds of innovation, organizationally innovation, but thirdly, without appropriating the philosophical foundations of secular culture. This is the short answer to the question why liberal churches fail and why most evangelical churches grow.